Okay, I think we are good to get started. So, welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by U.S. Senator Bob Casey's office and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I would first like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today to learn about emergency preparedness tips and FEMA disaster recovery programs, and in what ways Senator Casey's office may be of assistance to constituents. At the end of presentations, we will allow time for a Q&A, so please hold any questions until then. I do ask that you please keep your questions general and applicable to as many people as possible, since this is a public call. If you do have any questions about your own specific situation or case, we will be putting contact information for Senator Casey's office in our presentation for you to reach out directly. I want to start by introducing myself and another member of my team, and then I will hand it off to FEMA. So my name is Abby LaForme. I'm a constituent advocate for Senator Casey, and I work out of the Senator's Philadelphia office. I will be facilitating today's webinar. Also joining today's call from Senator Casey's team is Callie Anderson. She's our constituent advocate who works out of the Senator's Scranton office. So thank you, Callie, immensely for facilitating our slides. I'm now going to introduce the panelist members from FEMA. So from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, I am very excited to introduce Community Preparedness Officer of External Affairs, Jackie Robinson, and Recovery Outreach Coordinator, Pasha Fertala. We're very, very grateful for their time and willingness to partner with our office to help increase awareness about natural disaster preparedness and recovery. So at this time, I will now turn the call over to Community Preparedness Officer of External Affairs for FEMA, Jackie Robinson, and she will begin their segment of the webinar. Take it away, Jackie.
Hello all. So as you can see from the slide that's up, well, first off, yes, I am Jackie Robinson, the Community Preparedness Officer, FEMA Region 3, taking care of all things preparedness. And as all of you know, this month is National Preparedness Month, and this year's theme is Take Control in 1, 2, 3. Our focus on National Preparedness Month this month is older adults and people living with disabilities. So we've been focused on messaging and creating more opportunities to get information out there for the older adult community and for people living with disabilities. Next slide. So a lot of the things we've been going over this month are focused on some of these top tips we have for older adults, but not only older adults, caregivers. It's something we were thinking about in terms of who needed to be involved in the conversation. So we've been talking about planning on how you will communicate if you have communications needs, planning for food, water, and essentials for you and pets or service animals, researching pet-friendly evacuation centers, planning for your transportation if you need help evacuating, including items that meet your individual needs, such as medicines, medical supplies, batteries, and chargers in your emergency supply kit, and planning how you will have your assistive devices with you during an evacuation, and then making copies of Medicaid, Medicare, and other insurance cards. So we've been talking a lot about these tips this National Preparedness Month and going into more depth of what these different things mean. Perfect example I'm going to touch on: plan for your transportation if you need help evacuating. We've been talking a lot about this because a lot of this has to do with where you live, whether it be a more rural, more urban. Do you drive? Do you need assistance in evacuating? Do you have people in your area and in your network that can help assist you in evacuating if in fact evacuation is necessary? And then planning for your different individual needs. This is where it's important to take a step back and think about your vulnerabilities. Think about the vulnerabilities of not only yourself, but your home and what you might need in case a natural disaster happens and you're unable to get the assistive care that you normally get on a regular basis. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the exciting things that we've been doing this National Preparedness Month with the focused theme that we have this year. Our Disaster Preparedness and Older Adults Community Engagement Summit happened earlier, not quite in September. It was a little bit before that as our kickoff for National Preparedness Month. It was a great opportunity and engagement summit where we really were able to gather a lot of great information from local partners who also work with older adults, as well as older adults within the community who could help give feedback and let us know what their concerns are, and a lot about messaging and how we can create more effective and successful messaging in preparedness, so that people can create safe environments for themselves, but it also are getting the information they need. We just held our disaster preparedness for veterans and families event this past Saturday. It was an in-person event at the North Penn VFW. So it was local to all North Pennsylvania citizens, as well as people local to the Philadelphia area. It was only about 30 minutes from Philadelphia. And that event was awesome. We were able to provide some valuable tips for older veterans, as well as veterans living with disabilities and their family members. And then we also were able to work with some of our stakeholder partners like Fannie Mae to present at Disasters Don't Plan Ahead, but You Can. This was a virtual webinar where we presented on how you can help your older loved one in your family prepare, and helping encourage their employees to get involved with disaster preparedness. And that was a really awesome one. We had a great Q&A afterwards where employees were able to ask a lot of questions about volunteer opportunities and how they can get involved. And then we will be presenting at the Disaster Planning for Older Adults at the Southern Gerontological Society. I just learned how to say that correctly. Gerontological Society will be presenting at their 2-day event in October, also geared on disaster preparedness for older adults, but also they want to talk a lot about how their leadership can get involved in creating a safer environment for those that they care for. So that'll be a great opportunity to provide more positive messaging. Next slide. We do want to encourage you to join us online if you're not already. This is another platform and area in which we use the opportunity to promote preparedness messaging and speak to our community. We have our own X platform, which is at FEMA Region 3, like you can see in the top bullet above. We also have our Nextdoor account where we provide so much valuable preparedness information and disaster related information to the community. This is an awesome platform because it allows us to truly engage in conversation with the community and let them know what's going on in the world of FEMA and natural disasters. We will be hosting our first ever live event on Nextdoor where we'll be chatting with the community. This will take place tomorrow. We'll have a whole hour open up where we'll chat with the community about their concerns, about how we can help them gather more information and where they can find resources for disaster preparedness, and just talk about community preparedness as a whole and what can be done and what their thoughts are. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We hosted our first ever live LinkedIn event yesterday. It went great. This was geared towards businesses and the way local businesses and larger businesses can get involved in disaster preparedness. It went very well. It was an hour-long event where we had a lot of people tuned in, listening to how their businesses could both better prepare themselves, but also prepare their community and employees to stay safe. So we opened it up and had a great live Q&A at the end of that session that went really well. And we will continue to provide a lot of valuable information on LinkedIn throughout the entire year. So I also encourage you to follow us on those pages. You can follow FEMA on Facebook and Instagram. We don't have a regional page, but their headquarters and overall page is a great other valuable resource for information, as well as subscribing to our FEMA YouTube, and then keeping an eye on your local news for interviews and articles that come out by us that we'll be both producing this National Preparedness Month and throughout the entire year. Next slide. All right, before you go, we did want to provide are a couple resources that we have available for you to find more information on disaster preparedness, on what we are doing at FEMA Region 3 and at FEMA as a whole, and how you can stay up to date on all the most valuable information you can get to keep individuals and communities safe during times of disaster. We have our ready.gov site, we have the FEMA mobile app, we have our national preparedness links in there, and they all provide different information when it comes to absolutely every kind of disaster, absolutely every different kind of demographic of person that you can think of, and great, just valuable tools for both yourself, your family, your workplace, employees, coworkers, and communities as a whole. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to come on and talk to you guys a little bit about National Preparedness Month and disaster preparedness. And we will move on to the next slide. But thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, Jackie. Hi, everybody. My name is Kasha Furtawa. I'm in the Recovery Operations Branch here at FEMA Region 3. I work out of the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania office. Thank you so much for having me. So Jackie talked to you all about, the front end or the pre-disaster phase of preparedness and emergency management. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about how FEMA gets involved in the aftermath of disasters to help communities on the ground that have been impacted by disaster and to support them. But before I begin, I just wanted to highlight a phrase that we in the emergency management field use and kind of lay the land here. Disaster management is really best when it's locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. So if you're experiencing a flood or a tornado or any kind of natural or other disaster, that disaster is primarily going to be managed or first and foremost by your local first responders, your local governments. Those are the folks that know those communities on the ground that are being impacted. And then secondarily, it'll be state managed. So any state resources that can come in to support the local government and the local first responders will come in next. And then the federal government or FEMA, or Federal Emergency Management Agency, will support disasters that are out of when a state or the local governments are overwhelmed by the disaster. So I just kind of wanted to get that out first and explain kind of the overall emergency management concept of disaster management being locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. So next slide, please. So first I'll go over the disaster declaration process. So in order to receive FEMA assistance, the states or state governor or tribal executive, depending on the entity, would first request a disaster declaration. And that disaster declaration is presidentially decided. So the president will declare the disaster, and I'll get into that in a bit. And then that turns on federal disaster recovery programs, or we call them Stafford Act recovery programs. And that whole process is, as I mentioned, managed by or authorized by the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, or the Stafford Act as we call it. And then I'll go over also just FEMA's function as an interagency recovery coordinator. So we work, FEMA is not the end all be all of all federal resources that are available to local communities and state partners. We partner with other federal agencies like the Housing and Urban Development Department, Health and Human Services, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we at FEMA are kind of the belly button or the lead coordinator of those efforts. So I'll get into that as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, let's start at the beginning. A disaster occurs and the local executive, so your mayor or your county executive, will activate their emergency operations plan through their, generally Office of Emergency Management or maybe their fire department. And then secondarily, if it rises to the level necessary, the state governor will activate state resources or the state emergency management plan. Next slide, please. So once there are impacts from the disaster, the local, state, and or tribal governments will conduct an initial damage assessment. So they'll just go through and collect damages, whether that's to public infrastructure or residential homes, and kind of do an analysis of whether they believe that federal assistance is warranted. And if there's a possibility that FEMA assistance is warranted, the state governor will request joint preliminary damage assessments. And during joint PDAs, as we call them, FEMA and the state go out together to do on the ground assessments of damages. And then depending on the results of those assessments, the governor can then request a presidential disaster declaration, which goes through FEMA to the president. And it's ultimately the president's decision as to whether to declare a disaster and thereby authorize federal assistance to that state and to the local communities impacted and those counties that have been requested for the disaster declaration. And there's actually a very simple video that I've linked here on this slide. You can just Google it as well, how a disaster gets declared at FEMA.gov. It's a very simple, video graphic that goes through this process. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the joint preliminary damage assessment, before that's requested, the state will do their initial damage assessment with the local community that's been impacted, and then determine whether the damage exceeds the state's capabilities to manage or support, and then request a formal joint preliminary damage assessment of FEMA. And then, as I mentioned, FEMA and the state will conduct the damage assessment jointly. Next slide, please. So once the PDA is complete, there are two types of federal disaster declarations that I'll go over that can be requested and declared. So the first is actually on the right side of the screen here. I'll start with the emergency declaration. So the emergency declaration must be beyond the capabilities of the state or local governments. It supplements state response efforts such as mass evacuations, emergency sheltering, protecting property and public health and safety, to either lessen or avert the threat of disasters. So as an example, this could be, we know that a hurricane is going to make landfall in one of our states, and the impacts are, pretty definite. So the state may request federal assistance with sandbagging or other emergency protective measures, in which case, even though there haven't been impacts yet, the president can declare an emergency so that federal assistance is turned on, and we can support the states that are about to be impacted with preventative measures. So as I mentioned, so the emergency declaration can be issued prior to or immediately after the event, and it's generally not to exceed $5 million without additional congressional notification. And the cost share would be 75% federal government and then 25% state government. Major disaster declaration turns on additional programs, which I'll go over here in a second. Also needs to be beyond the state capabilities to handle the disaster. And it must be requested within 30 days of the incident. So generally, a major disaster declaration is requested after the preliminary damage assessment, though there is, in a catastrophic event, think Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, or Hurricane Sandy, those may be expedited major disaster declarations without doing a complete preliminary damage assessment because it's so catastrophic that it's known that the president will declare the disaster and turn on federal assistance. And again, generally the cost share for those by the Stafford Act or per the Stafford Act is 75% federal government and 25% non-federal government share. So meaning the federal government will cover costs of 75% of the costs, and then the 25% is the responsibility of the non-federal partner. Next slide, please. So next I'll go into what disaster recovery programs are actually turned on when there is a disaster declaration. So again, this is primarily focused on the major disaster declaration. Next slide, please. So first I'll start with individual assistance. This is probably what most of the public thinks of when they think of FEMA assistance. So, FEMA workers in the field, walking from door to door of survivors, kind of distributing water or asking about shelters or running shelters. But we also provide housing assistance and financial assistance for other needs besides housing. So individual assistance is for eligible individuals and households who have sustained losses as a direct result of the disaster. So the survivor needs to be in a county that has been authorized under the declaration. And so homeowners and renters who sustain damage to their homes, vehicles, personal property, businesses, or inventory can apply for disaster assistance. And you can just go to disasterassistance.gov, or you can call if you are impacted. There's multiple ways to apply for FEMA assistance if there's a disaster declaration. And assistance can include grants to help pay for temporary housing, emergency home repairs, uninsured and underinsured property losses, and medical, dental, and funeral expenses caused by the disaster, and other serious disaster-related expenses. It's important to note that the disaster assistance grants are not taxable income. And so I do want to mention here, FEMA individual assistance is not intended to make survivors whole after a disaster. It's really kind of it's meant for uninsured or underinsured survivors of disasters and to help them kind of get to the next step. But it can't cover every single loss. So I just did want to put that out there. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of assistance that's available under the individual assistance program. So mass care and emergency services, the individuals and households program that I mentioned, which is the assistance to individuals and households, including housing assistance, and then other needs assistance for things like funeral expenses or dental or medical caused by disasters. There's disaster case management, which is essentially a grant that's given to the state to help survivors manage their cases, because we recognize that federal disaster assistance is a complicated process for survivors going through the toughest time in their lives. So this provides funding to the state to essentially bring on case managers to help survivors through all the hurdles of disaster assistance, essentially. Crisis counseling assistance is available under the IA program, disaster legal services, disaster unemployment assistance, and then voluntary agency coordination. So we do partner very closely with voluntary organizations to, again, help bridge the gap between where the survivor is today and where they need to be. Next slide, please. I'm sorry that this slide is so small to read, but I won't go into it too much in depth. I did link it here. I just wanted to kind of highlight that, this is the sequence of delivery for individual assistance, disaster assistance. So again, you'd start out with voluntary agencies and mass care, and your insurance if you have it. This is another plug for the National Flood Insurance Policy Program. If you don't have flood insurance, we do live in a flood-prone region. So definitely look into that. And then FEMA housing assistance and other needs assistance may be available depending on the individual applicant. And then again, we partner very closely with voluntary agencies for any unmet needs that are not covered by either FEMA or SBA assistance. Next slide, please. This is a little bit off topic from, the natural disasters of hurricanes and floods and tornadoes, but I did want to just highlight that during the COVID-19 pandemic, funeral assistance became available for families or loved ones dealing with COVID-19 funerals or funerals resulting from COVID-19. So this program is still available. I know that, COVID-19 isn't on the forefront of everyone's minds like it was 3 years ago, but the program is still available through September 2025. So please take a look at it if you think you might be eligible. Again, you can search COVID-19 funeral assistance and the website is very helpful, but you could receive up to $9,000 through FEMA for COVID-19 funeral assistance, assuming you paid for a funeral of a loved one out of pocket, essentially, since January 2020. Next slide, please. So the other program, the Stafford Act program that turns on or can be turned on following a disaster declaration is public assistance. So while individual assistance helps individual families and individual survivors through disaster recovery, public assistance is a grant program that's for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, as well as certain types of private nonprofits. So essentially communities, so that they can quickly respond to and recover from major disasters. So examples of projects under public assistance would be restoration of government buildings, such as schools, parks and recreation facilities, utilities facilities, restoration of infrastructure like damaged roads and bridges, and then debris removal from public roadways and infrastructure. Next slide, please. Public assistance, there's the eligibility for public assistance is essentially a pyramid. So first you have to be an eligible applicant. So as I mentioned, either a state, local, tribal government or a certain private nonprofit. And then the facility needs to also be eligible. And then the work that's being done needs to be one of these categories of work under public assistance. So we will cover emergency work, including debris removal and emergency protective measures. And then also permanent work, which is the restoration, as I mentioned, of roads, bridges, water control facilities, buildings, equipment, utilities, and parks and recreational facilities. Cost also needs to be eligible. Next slide, please. So generally, the public assistance program is meant to, build back to pre-disaster conditions, but there is a section under the Stafford Act, hazard mitigation, under the public assistance program, where we can incorporate hazard mitigation into a public assistance project to essentially, disaster-proof it from future conditions. And make it a hardier infrastructure, essentially. Next slide, please. So again, just wanted to highlight the difference between the two programs that can be turned on, recovery programs under the Stafford Act following a disaster declaration. That could be individual assistance or public assistance. And, both of these could be requested by the state. One of these could be requested by the state, just depends on the impacts of the disaster and whether they warrant federal assistance. Next slide, please. So again, I wanted just to quickly touch on interagency recovery coordination. I mentioned earlier that FEMA is not the only federal partner that supports local communities after a disaster, but we are kind of the coordinator of all the other federal agencies in this process. Next slide, please. So the National Disaster Recovery Framework builds out a coordination structure for how the whole community builds, sustains, and coordinates delivery of recovery capabilities. So FEMA, like I mentioned, is essentially the belly button for those efforts, those coordination efforts. And we bring in other resources, like I said, HUD, HHS or Health and Human Services, other federal agencies, voluntary agencies, etc., under this National Disaster Recovery Framework to help support states and local communities. Next slide, please. And the Recovery Support Function Leadership Group, so the coordinating structure is essentially built around these 6 areas of recovery or recovery support functions. So the first is community assistance, for which FEMA is the lead. The economic RSF is led by Commerce. The Health and Social Services RSF is led by Health and Human Services. The Housing RSF is led by HUD. The Infrastructure Systems RSF is led by the U.S. Army Corps. And then Natural and Cultural Resources RSF is led by the Department of Interior. And again, it depends on the disaster as to whether one or all of these or anywhere in between RSFs are activated following a disaster. Next slide, please. That is all I have on federal disaster recovery assistance. Pending any questions. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jackie and Kasha, for sharing all of that really good information. I will now give a short overview on how Senator Casey's office may be of assistance to constituents regarding any issue they may be having with FEMA or any other issues navigating federal agencies. Next slide. Alrighty. So the heart of Team Casey Constituent Services, which is, the bread and butter work of our office, it lies within our constituent services staff. So we do have a constituent services staff of around 10 members at any given time, the majority of which work out of our Harrisburg office, which is the hub of our constituent services work. Each advocate is monitoring dozens of cases at a time, and because our office receives so many cases, our advocates have designated assignment areas that their cases fall under. So we call those clusters. For example, I'm a constituent advocate, and in my cluster of casework are Veterans Affairs cases, Social Security Administration cases, Office of Personnel Management cases, FEMA cases, of course. So not every advocate is an expert on all federal government agencies. Clusters are our way of specializing in certain topics so that we can best help constituents. Other than the day-to-day calls and emails exchanged between constituent advocates and the people we serve, it's also the job of constituent advocates to remain knowledgeable of any developing trends, new legislation, and news related to the topics and agencies that they work with. So for example, like I said, I work on lots of VA cases, so I'm constantly attending internal VA meetings to stay up to date on new developments in legislation passed by that agency. Next slide. So these are just a few examples of the topics we see and we commonly assist constituents with. Next slide. This is a visual of some of the many agencies we've been working with. You can see that FEMA is toward the bottom of the slide. So these specific agencies are members of our office are in contact with literally every single day, but in general, we can assist with matters regarding any federal agency. So if it is a government agency, our office can probably assist. Next slide. So there are many ways to get in contact with our office. These are the main 3. A lot of people will try any of them at any given time. So you can go on our website. There's a specific page on our website where you're able to type out and submit a request for casework. You can put in all of your contact information in there so that we can, get back to you, and that would be on our website. You can also call any of our offices. I did put the phone number for the Harrisburg office in here as an example. So that phone number is 717-231-7540. We also do have a toll-free number for anyone who needs that. I do encourage everyone who calls our office and does not get through to someone right away to please leave a voicemail with your name, your contact info, and just a little bit of information about, the problem you're experiencing. I know based on my cases that a lot of people, if they don't get through to someone over the phone right away, they really do fear that, no one is going to get back to them. But let me just let you know that if you leave your information, someone from our team, even if it takes, a day or a week or so, we will get back to you if it's an issue that you need to talk to someone about. So we really do work very hard to do that. So please just leave a voicemail with your information if you don't get through. A lot of people, if you're not, particularly tech savvy, you're welcome to send in a request to our office by mail as well through USPS. You can just write a letter out or type out a letter with what you're experiencing, send it by mail to us. This is the office address of our office in Harrisburg. So that's the office of U.S. Senator Bob Casey, 200 North 3rd Street, Suite 14A in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 17101. But like I said, you're welcome to contact our office using any of these methods and we will get back to you. So next slide. So what happens after you call our office with your issue and we determine that it is best to reach out to the federal agency in question? Your case would first be assigned to one of the constituent advocates, so someone like me or my colleague Callie, who's doing the slides. Your case will first be assigned to one of our constituent advocates in our office who works on that issue area or with that agency in particular. Our advocate, depending on what the issue is, we would have you fill out a standard privacy release form, which is a simple but very important 2-page document that gives our office the legal consent to reach out to a government agency on your behalf. Our office would then take that form, a description of the problem you're facing, along with any supporting documentation that you would like to provide to us. We'll take that all to the agency, and we call this a congressional inquiry. So when it comes to giving the time for agencies to respond to the congressional inquiry, we do give most agencies around 30 days, business days, to receive, review, and respond to the inquiries. Some agencies do require a longer response time. And if an agency does not respond to our office within those 30 days, we will follow up with the agency. I will give a couple important notes on the congressional inquiry process that are really important to establish. So under the law and rules of the United States Senate, our office cannot force an agency to expedite a case or act in one's favor. We cannot offer legal advice or recommend an attorney. We also cannot get involved in matters that are under the jurisdiction of a court or any legal entity. And we cannot intervene in matters that are not under our jurisdiction. So those would be matters under the jurisdiction of a school district, one's local government, or the state government. So really important to establish those things. We will do absolutely everything we can, but there are certain things that legally our office just cannot do. So next slide. I'm just emphasizing all of our contact info here. This is how you get in contact with any member of Senator Casey's office should you have, a case that you need to bring to our attention and you need help resolving an issue. So next slide. All right. So thank you everyone for listening to all of this. We will now open this portion of the presentation for questions for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or our office, Senator Casey's office. So if you do have a question, there is a raise hand feature of WebEx. You should be able to press the raise hand button, and that's at the bottom of the participants list to indicate that you have a question. I can then give you the permission to unmute yourselves. You can ask the question, we can answer your question, and then we can move along to the next. So we do have some time left over. I'll give everyone a second to get that together. If anyone has any questions, I am looking at the attendees list right now. So. Okay, I see a couple raised hands start to come in. So I will just start as I see them. So Paul James, you should theoretically be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Just a quick question regarding the presentation on Nextdoor. from FEMA. They said it was tomorrow, but what time?
Kasha or Jackie, are either of you able to answer that question on FEMA's behalf?
We're gonna
think
check,
that
just
was-
give us a few minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jackie.
Jackie, you're currently muted, so if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm not sure if Jackie's able to unmute herself. This is Lynn Newman with FEMA. It's tomorrow from 3 to 4.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You can theoretically mute yourself back. So
Aye.
I appreciate you doing that, and then I'll get to the next question. Okay, I'm now going to give permission to Lisa Miller. Lisa, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Is this presentation being recorded so that we could watch it later if we felt like doing so?
Yes, absolutely. This meeting has been recorded from the get-go. And after the meeting, we will edit it down, and then we will share a link to the recording with everyone who's registered. So that includes you. And then we also eventually will get it onto the Senator's YouTube channels for anyone to watch afterwards. So
Okay,
recording
thank
should
you.
be coming, but it may take some time.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, I see Ray Holland, so I'm gonna give you permission. You should be able to unmute yourself.
You mentioned, I think, 3 things that you cannot help with. I know one of them was legal advice. What were the other 2, or however many there were?
Yes, so yeah, anything, legal or under the courts, or something that you would need to make a police report about, for that matter, that's typically something we
Okay.
can't get involved in. Also, matters pertaining to a school district, local education board, and also anything that is the matter that is under the jurisdiction of a different form of government. So a lot of times people say someone is having an issue with their EBT or SNAP, food stamp benefits. That is a program that's actually administered by the state. So we would encourage you to reach out to your local state elected officials, for example. So that would be your member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives or the Pennsylvania Senate.
Okay, so something under the jurisdiction of the state, something under the
Yes.
jurisdiction of a school board, and legal advice.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, so I'll give it another moment or two if anyone has, any lingering questions. If Callie, if you want to back up a slide and put our contact info back on, that may be helpful for people as well if they have, any follow-up. Lynn, I do see your hand raised if you want to, say anything.
Great. All right, thank you so much. Just wanted to say thank you so much to Abby and Callie and the Office of Senator Bob Casey for hosting this webinar. This was really great, and I hope that the attendees were able to get some really great tips regarding national preparedness, as well as recovery and some of the programs that we do offer. So thank you again. We look forward to continuing to work with your office, serving as a resource, as well as participating in future webinars. So again, we hope this information was helpful, and we are so appreciative. And again, we look forward to working with you again.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Yeah, thank you everyone for participating on today's presentation. We're obviously especially thankful for you and the rest of our FEMA colleagues, especially Jackie and Kasha, for their presentations as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today and, providing this helpful information. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. The meeting recording should be coming soon. And yeah, anyone, if you need us, you know where to find us. So take care.